Thank you, Nikki. Our next guest is a retired NASA astronaut, a decorated fighter pilot and test pilot, explorer, entrepreneur, and humanitarian. So we should all just go home. He flew on both the US Space Shuttle and the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. Please welcome Ron Garan.
Good evening. Hi. Thank you. Do you want to hear a story? Maybe I should step back a little bit. Well, good, because I want to tell you a story. I want to tell you a story about a monumental event that happened nearly 50 years ago. An event that fundamentally changed the way we see ourselves. An event that, although it forever changed the course of human history, it's an event that, for the most part, has been forgotten. The story starts on a winter morning of December 21st, 1968, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Atop the tallest, the heaviest, the most powerful rocket ever brought to operational status, the Saturn V, sat the crew of Apollo 8, Commander Frank Borman, Command Module Pilot Jim Lovell, and Lunar Module Pilot Bill Anders. The goal of the mission is to become the first crewed spacecraft to travel to the moon, enter into orbit around the moon, and of course, return safely to Earth. 3 days later, on December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1968, as the crew of Apollo 8 came up from behind the dark side of the moon on their fourth orbit, they experienced something never seen before by human eyes. Commander Borman was the first to see the amazing sight, and he called in excitement to the others, taking a black and white photo in the process. Bill Anders took the more famous color photo, and it was all captured on the flight voice recorder.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, that's pretty. Hey, don't take that, I'll judge you. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick. Oh man, that's crazy. Quick.
As the crew saw the Earth coming up from behind the lunar horizon, I wonder if they realized the significance of that moment. They had just become the first humans in history to see the whole planet hanging in the blackness of space, and the first to capture that for the rest of us. This image, known as Earthrise, is probably the most influential photograph ever taken, with its simple message that we are one people traveling on one planet towards one common future. This revolutionized how we see our world, how we see ourselves. 4 decades later, I also was able to see our planet from the vantage point of space.
Just start. 3 coming up.
3, 2,
3 to 100. Hang on.
booster ignition.
Auto 2,
Liftoff.
auto 2.
Discovery.
Auto.
Mate Kudasai.
I see 3 at 104. I see a command and a roll. Houston, Discovery, roll program. I am LB Lynch. Roger roll, Discovery.
Houston now controlling the flight of Discovery, a man-made rising sun.
Oh, what a view up the side. All right, the digitals.
At 8.5 minutes after liftoff, all of us inside the spacecraft went from being pushed into our seats at a force 3 times our weight, 3 Gs, to being weightless instantly as the 3 main engines cut off abruptly according to plan. At this point, I thought to myself, we made it. By that, I meant we survived, but I was also acutely aware that my childhood dream of flying in space had just come true. But on that first day in space, the most memorable moment was when I got to look out the window for the first time, when I was able to unstrap, float over to a window, and take in this beautiful scene. It was just absolutely breathtaking. This was an incredibly moving visual experience, but it was much, much more than just a visual experience. What I experienced in space was a profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the opportunity to see the planet from that perspective, and gratitude for the planet that we've been given. And in some way, I can't really fully explain. Being physically detached from the Earth made me feel deeply interconnected with everyone on it. Now, this feeling of interconnectedness became even more real on my second mission to space. My second mission to space, where I spent half of 2011 living and working on board the International Space Station, started with a launch from Kazakhstan on a Soyuz spacecraft. During my 6 months in space, I got into a routine where I would almost say goodnight to the Earth. As it was time to get ready for bed, I'd go to the cupola, which is this windowed observatory on the bottom of the space station. I would just look back at the Earth for a little while. And as I would gaze back at this beautiful scene, I would think about what the next 50 years are going to look like. How far would we progress in overcoming the challenges and problems facing our planet? Now, I launched into space with the belief that right now we already have all the resources, all the technology necessary to solve many, if not all, the problems facing our planet. So I spent a good deal of my time Earth gazing, pondering the question, if this is true, why do they still remain? The seeds to the answer to that question were planted 3 years earlier on my first space flight. On the third spacewalk of that mission, my feet were clamped to the end of the space station's robotic arm. And with me attached to the arm, it was flown through a maneuver that we called the windshield wiper, which took me across a big arc across the top of the space station and back. At the top of this arc, I was 100 feet above the space station, looking down at this enormous complex against the backdrop of our indescribably beautiful planet, 240 miles below. It took my breath away. But more compelling than the beauty of this scene was the incredible human accomplishment that the space station represents. It's not only a technological accomplishment, probably the most complicated, complex structure ever built, but it's an amazing example of the power of cooperation. 15 nations built the International Space Station. Some of these nations weren't always the best of friends. Some were on opposite sides of the Cold War, opposite sides of the space race. Some fought wars against each other. But somehow, they were able to set aside their differences and do this amazing thing in space. And as I hovered up there above the space station, I wondered, what would the world look like if we could overcome our political and our cultural barriers to collaboration and bring that same level of cooperation down to the Earth's surface? Now, I was born in the year that Unrig Garan became the first human to fly in space. 50 years later, almost to the day, from the very same launch pad that Unrig Garan launched from, I launched into space as a fully integrated member of a Russian spacecraft crew with a couple of Russian military officers. And as we stood at the base of this rocket that would take us to space on a cold April evening from a previous top-secret Soviet military installation, I looked up at the rocket and I saw an American flag and a Russian flag side by side. That image was burned into me. For the first 15 years of my adult life, I trained to fight the Russians, our nation's most menacing enemy at the time. I was a Cold War fighter pilot stationed at the tip of the sword in former West Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall, and I fought in combat in another part of the world where I saw firsthand the horrors of war. Back then, I was operating in a two-dimensional us versus them world. Unfortunately, this is still the primary operating system of our planet. This is the image of our world that our civilization is presently based on. A two-dimensional landscape of nation states fighting and competing over resources and ideologies. A landscape where not only nations compete, but corporations, NGOs, special interest groups, political parties. And this is the real world. This is the image taken by the Apollo 8 astronauts nearly 50 years ago. This image proclaims the truth that we are one people traveling together through the universe on one planet towards one shared destiny. From this vantage point, you can't see nation states. What you can see is the fragile oasis of our home planet Earth. So let's look back at this two-dimensional image again. This is something that we created, not based on reality. It may have served us in the past. It may have been appropriate before we realized how interdependent we all are. It may have been appropriate before we realized that we could destroy the very life support systems of our planet. And it may have been appropriate back when nation states could operate in relative isolation. This is no longer the appropriate guidepost for our actions. This, and neither is this, this gerrymandered map, or this, or this. This is the appropriate guidepost for our actions. This is reality. The problem is, our political decisions are currently based on the two-dimensional map. So in order for humanity to progress and to prosper, we need to deal with the very real problems that we face in the context of the real world. We need to build a future based on the image of Earthrise. The image of Earthrise has three key pillars: interdependence, long-term thinking, and profound collaboration, all wrapped in the blanket of empathy and compassion. We can no longer have a two-dimensional map as our model. Humanity is at a critical point, a point like never before in history. We're at a critical fork in the road. Before us are two paths. One is to continue down the two-dimensional us versus them path that we're presently on, to continue living under the lie that special interest groups, political parties can pursue their own self-interest independent of our country and the world, to continue down the path of increased nationalism, tribalism, parochialism, all which will lead to despair and destruction. The other path is founded on the principles of Earthrise, which will lead to a visionary, restorative future, a future where 10 billion humans can live within our planetary limits in peace and prosperity, a future we would all want to be a part of. I'm here representing a coalition of international astronauts that are coming together to promote the values of Earthrise. We have proven that by working together, we can accomplish anything. By all of you being here, you've already stepped up to be agents of change. You already embody this new system. So let's come together and build a future that we'd all want to be a part of. And so, to bring this home, I want to share with you another story. I want to share with you the story of my return to Earth after my 6-month mission in space. When it was time to return, my 2 Russian crewmates and I got into our Soyuz spacecraft, we undocked, we did a couple of laps around our planet, and as we crossed the south tip of South America, we fired our engines to enter into the atmosphere. We had this fiery, violent ride through the atmosphere at 5 miles a second. The parachutes opened, they threw us all over the place. Eventually, we smashed into the ground. We bounced, we rolled, we flipped over. And now my window is pointed at the ground. And out of my window, I saw a rock, a flower, and a blade of grass. And I remember thinking to myself, I'm home. And what was really interesting about that thought was I was home, but I was in Kazakhstan. So to me, at that moment, my home wasn't just Houston, Texas, where at the time I lived with my family. My home was Earth. And our definition of that word home has profound implications for how we problem solve, how we treat our planet, how we treat each other. And broadening our definition of the word home does not come with it a requirement to abandon where we came from, our political or cultural affinities. It simply means putting all those things, looking at those things in the context of the bigger picture. So, as a fellow crewmate on Spaceship Earth, I want to thank all of you for what you're doing and what you will do to help make life on our planet as beautiful as our planet looks from space. And by working together, we do not have to accept the status quo, the political status quo in our country. So together, let's nudge the trajectory of our country and our world to a more beautiful future for all. Thank you.